My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask pardon for my sins and the grace to make these moments of prayer fruitful. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. The Gospel of today's Mass begins by telling us that Jesus sent his disciples away towards Bethsaida in a boat while he sent the crowds away. Then we hear, after saying goodbye to them, he went off into the hills to pray. And that's where we go with you again today, Jesus. It's nice to hear that you actually physically go away in order to pray, which is the same as what we often try to do. At least it's what we often long to do because, let's face it, the day gets too busy too easily, and it seems that there's often just not even the possibility of getting away to be alone with you. But then I look at you and see that precisely today, after you had been so busy, was when you needed to find space. And I think of the way that earlier in this chapter, before today's Gospel, you told your disciples, come away to some lonely place all by yourselves and rest for a while, since they had been so busy that, as the Gospel says, there was no time for them even to eat. And then people come looking for help, and you struggle to turn away from them, and in compassion you stay with them, and in the end, we arrive to the end of the day, you must have been absolutely exhausted, and we have today's Gospel passage. Well, if you needed to escape to pray every now and then, and your disciples the same, I don't doubt that we need to too. But I especially like the fact that in today's Gospel, you go away to the hills to pray. It says a lot to me about what we get out of prayer. It's not just a peaceful time where we're not surrounded by distractions. When we get away to pray, we have a bit of peace and quiet, but also a different perspective. It helps us to see our priorities for what they are, not for how they appear. It's like when someone comes to ask us for something, whatever it might be, what they need is made a priority because the person is right there asking, but it may not actually be the most important thing. Now, it's good to respond to things like that, but if all we do is respond to others, we don't end up prioritizing what really matters. And, of course, often the people we need to dedicate time to are precisely those who don't come asking for things. Beyond that, God himself doesn't come knocking at the door to ask us for things. He wants us to stop, to think, and to choose. That way, choosing to prioritize God is the opposite of simply responding, which is what makes it so valuable to him, and why our spiritual life is so deeply ours, our responsibility. Now, let's get back to the Gospel, where we were with Jesus while he went to the hills to pray. Praying in the hills has a nice overtone. From the top of a hill, your perspective changes completely. You can see a lot more of the big picture. You get a vision of the whole land. Probably Jesus could even watch his disciples floundering away in the boat from there. It's not just that we're looking at different stuff from a hill, but that we see it from a different perspective. And that's what prayer does for us. It gives us another dimension by which we're actually able to put everything in its place, to see how it works, or at least to see how it should work. Have you ever read a book called Flatland? It's a tiny little book, so small you could read it in a couple of hours, written by a guy named Edwin Abbott around the end of the 19th century. Now, Abbott wrote this book as a criticism of the society in which he lived. He felt that people were stratified according to their social status, and many were unjustly treated on account of that. And then, on top of all that, most people, especially the powerful, were reluctant to consider anything different. So he presents a story which explains the difficulty in changing the way one sees the world. This tiny little novel takes place in a world called Flatland, which is a world of only 2 dimensions. The protagonist of his story is merely carrying on with his life, when all of a sudden he's interrupted by something inconceivable. There's some sort of person in his lounge room who ought not to be there. This visitor has seemingly appeared out of nowhere, and he can't see the visitor properly, so doesn't know what type of person he is. It turns out that the visitor is a person who has come to Flatland from the world of 3 dimensions, commonly known as spaceland. Now, the visitor has enormous trouble convincing our protagonist that he really is what he says. The protagonist, we never know his name, it's written in the first person, can't even conceive of a 3rd dimension. But at the same time, he can't explain how his visitor can seemingly break the laws of physics in his 2-dimensional world. He can enter a room without going through an entranceway. He can see into a cupboard without opening the door. He can appear and disappear at will. He can seemingly change even his size and shape, all because he's working with a 3rd dimension. Well, it's only an analogy, but I think it's pretty clear. Prayer pulls us out of the immediate, what's always right in front of us, and helps us to understand things from a very different perspective. Even if we can't see it fully, like that 2-dimensional character in Flatland couldn't actually see a 3rd dimension, he could understand it and then begin to live his life in accord with a greater reality. But of course, with God, it's not merely another dimension. It's a whole shift of a much greater nature, one that opens up enormous horizons. Are we ever going to see it physically? Not in this lifetime, at least. But like our friend from Flatland, we recognize its existence and begin to live our lives in accord with that. Again, returning to the gospel, Jesus, I wonder what you saw, even physically, from your vantage point on the hill. It was evening time, so I suppose you saw the shadows of the hills slowly creeping over the lake. You could have looked around and seen the towns and villages dotting the lakeside, towns you had been in, and in which you must have encountered so many people. Probably many from the crowds whom you just sent away came from those towns, and I wonder if you didn't think of them, pray about them, thinking of what would be in their hearts as they journeyed along the way after having been with you, and especially at the miracle of the loaves and fishes that they had just experienced a few hours ago. Certainly, at times, when I end up doing my prayer in a park or in a plaza in the middle of the city, or in a building where I can look out from several stories up, I can't help but think of the people that make up that city. Our cities are so full of so many souls, and the life of each one of them is an epic. But the depth and importance of all those souls are sort of vaporized in the anonymity of a multitude. Just one of those souls is worth all the blood of Christ, and yet, in the crowds, they all seem to have their worth hidden away very far from our sight. Again, that's why we need prayer. I think of you, Jesus, with the crowds that followed you, and I wonder how you prayed for them. I also think just now of someone like Thomas Merton. He's a fellow who initially had a rather colourful life, let's say, and then converted and became a Trappist monk. He's something of a contentious figure because his later works appeared too muddled with different spiritualities, but his earlier stuff is absolutely fantastic. As a monk, he lived a life of prayer according to the spirit of his order. In the context of our prayer today, we could say that, in a certain sense, he was living on the hill with Jesus in prayer. One day he went into the nearby city of Louisville and was suddenly struck by the greatness of those souls around him. He saw them, he says, all walking around, shining like the sun. He later wrote, "If only we could see each other that way all the time, there would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. But this cannot be seen, only believed and understood." We pause and contemplate the souls who make up our world, whether we live in a city or elsewhere, and we rediscover them in all their goodness. And of course, this is merely one tiny fragment of everything that we discover in prayer. I wonder also if Jesus, praying on that hill, didn't think of far-off, more distant lands, places he couldn't see, but full of people he longed to be close to. It's a good reminder for me that prayer doesn't extract us from the earth. It helps us to love it in its entirety. That's the same thing we've seen in the saints, like St. John Paul II, who was so Polish and at the same time so much in love with all the peoples of the world and their cultures. And of course, St. Josemaria, whose birthday we celebrate today, how much he encouraged us to love all the peoples of the world in order to be truly Catholic. But to do that best, we look for the change of vision that we get from taking time to be alone with God, to see things from his point of view. We can ask Our Lady for help to be willing to climb the hill with Jesus, so to speak, to make the effort to find time alone with God for our prayer. It's tough because the reality is it's hard to care enough about that different vision, that perspective, when there is so much stuff around to distract us. And then when we're tired, it's hard to do like Jesus does in today's gospel. He's been busy and is tired, so he climbs a hill and goes to pray. But when we're busy and tired, it's just much easier to pull out the phone and go to Instagram or YouTube or whatever. But while a phone can entertain us with colours, it can never give us perspective. Just the opposite. It reduces our vision, narrows it down, keeps us focused on ourselves. Changing perspective takes a lot more effort, but it even relaxes us more and puts life in its true context. So we go to our Mother with this petition today. We ask her to help us to find time alone with God, to help us to rediscover souls in all their goodness and all their glory, and of course, to help us to rediscover God himself and to see things as he does, as he wants us to see them too. I thank you, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations which you have communicated to me in this time of prayer. I ask your assistance in putting them into effect. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.